Greetings, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together. What a special evening this is to read our concluding Torah portion in the book of Genesis. This is New Year's Eve 2020. And so we're going to be discussing, as part of our theme, the nature of endings. And one of the themes that we're going to cover is,
so I don't break them.
One of the themes that we're going to cover is how we handle endings has a big influence on how we're able to enter into new beginnings. So with that, our Torah portion, which is Parshat Vayechi, begins in book of Genesis, chapter 47, verse 28. If you have a copy of the Chumash, I invite you to turn there. And I will invite all of us to unmute ourselves so that we can together recite our blessing for the wonderful opportunity of sharing Torah with one another. So we say our blessing. Baruch Eloheinu
melech haolam
asher
Torah.
Thank you, God, for this opportunity to immerse ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. So once again, I invite you to go ahead and mute, and I will begin our reading, and then I'll invite everyone to take an opportunity to share some verses from our Torah portion. So again, we are on chapter 47, verse 28. Jacob lived 17 years in the land of Egypt, so that the span of Jacob's life came to 147 years. And when the time approached for Israel to die, he summoned his son Joseph and said to him, "Do me this favor, place your hand under my thigh as a pledge of your steadfast loyalty. Please do not bury me in Egypt. When I lie down with my fathers, take me up from Egypt and bury me in their burial place." He replied, "I will do as you have spoken." And he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed at the head of the bed. We're now in the beginning of chapter 48. Dave, would you like to read some verses beginning there at the very start of chapter 48?
Sometime afterward, Joseph was told, "Your father is ill." So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. When Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph has come to see you," Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, "El Shaddai appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and he blessed me. And he said to me, 'I will make you fertile and numerous, making of you a community of people, and I will assign this land to your offspring to come for an everlasting possession.' Now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt shall be mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, no less than Reuben and Simeon. But progeny born to you and after them shall be yours. They shall be recorded instead of their brothers in their inheritance. I do this because when I was returning from Padan, Rachel died to my sorrow while I was journeying in the land of Canaan. When still some distance short of Ephraim, I buried her there on the road to Ephrath, now Bethlehem.
Thank you, Dave. Steve, would you like to begin reading at verse 8?
Yes, thank you. You want to kill your sound? Okay. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he asked, "Who are these?" And Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons, whom God has given me here." He, Jacob, said, "Bring them to me, pray, and that I may bless them." Israel's eyes had grown clouded with age. He could no longer see. Joseph brought them over to him, whereupon he kissed and hugged them. Israel then said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face again, and here God has shown me your progeny as well." Joseph then removed them from his knees and bowed down before him to the ground. Then Joseph took the two of them, Ephraim with his right hand to Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand to Israel's right. And he brought them close to him. But Israel stretched out his right hand and placed it on Ephraim's head, even though he was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, crossing his arms, though Manasseh was the firstborn. He then blessed Joseph, saying, "The God before whom walked my fathers Abraham and Isaac, the God who has shepherded me ever since I came into being until this day, the angel who has rescued me from all harm, bless these lads. Through them, let my name and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, ever be recalled, and let them greatly multiply within the land."
Thank you, Steve.
When
Martine,
Joseph
would you like
saw
to?
that his father had placed his right hand on Ephraim's head, it seemed wrong to him, so he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to the head of Manasseh. Joseph said to his father, "Not that way, father. This is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused, saying, "I know, my son, I know. He too shall become a people, and he too shall be great. Yet his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations." So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you shall the people of Israel give their blessing, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." And he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh.
Thank you, Steve. Martine, would you like to begin reading there at verse 21?
Thank you, Rabbi. Israel then said to Joseph, "I am dying now, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your ancestors. And I have given you, first among your brothers, the Shechem mountain ridge, which I won from the Amorites with my sword and my bow." Jacob then summoned his sons, saying, "Gather round that I may tell you what shall befall to you in the days to come. Assemble and hearken, O sons of Jacob. Hearken to Israel, your father. Reuben, my firstborn, you are my strength and first fruit of my vigor, excessive in exalting yourself, excessive in strength. Licentious one, boil up like water no more. Oh, you mounted your father's bed, then defiled my couch. He mounted my couch. Simeon and Levi are partners. Instruments of violence are their plan. Let me not enter their council, nor let my being join their assembly. For they killed a man in their wrath, and in their whim hand-strung an ox. Cursed is their wrath so fierce, and their fury so harsh. I will disperse them in Jacob, scatter them in Israel.
Thank you, Martine. Let me invite Richard. Would you like to begin reading at verse 8?
Yes, thank you. You, O Judah, your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the nape of your foes. Your father's sons shall bow low to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. On prey, my son, have you grown. He crouches, lies down like a lion, like the king of beasts. Who dare rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, so that tribute shall come to him, and the homage of peoples be his. He tethers his ass to a vine. His ass is full to a choice vine. He washes his garments in wine. His robe is blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine. His teeth are whiter than milk. Zebulun shall dwell by the seashore. He shall be a haven for ships, and his flank shall rest on Sidon.
Thank you, Richard.
Issachar, yes.
Thank you, Richard. Let me invite Joan. Would you like to read a little bit, Joan, beginning at verse 14?
Thank you, Rabbi. Issachar is a strong-boned ass, crouching among the sheepfolds. When he saw how good was security and how pleasant was the country, he bent his shoulder to the burden and became a toiling serf. Dan shall govern his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the road, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels, so that the rider is thrown backward. I wait for your deliverance, O Lord. Gad shall be raided by raiders, but he shall raid at their herds. Asher's head shall be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties. Naphtali is a hind, her loose, which yields lovely fawns. Joseph is a wild ass by a spring, wild colts on a hillside. Archers bitterly assailed him. They shot at him and harried him, yet his bow stayed taut, and his arms were made firm by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. There, the shepherd, the rock of Israel, the God of your father who helps you, and Shaddai who blesses you, with blessings of the heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches below, blessings of the breast and womb. The blessings of your father surpass the blessings of my ancestors. To the utmost bounds of the eternal hills, may they rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the elect of his brothers.
Thank you. Let me invite Mark. Would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 27?
Thank you for the opportunity. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he consumes the foe, and in the evening he divides the spoil. All these were the tribes of Israel, 12 in number, and this is what their father said to them as he bade them farewell, addressing to each a parting word appropriate to him. Then he instructed them, saying to them, I'm about to be gathered to my kin. Bury me with my fathers in the cave which is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, cave which is in the field of Machpelah, facing Mamre in the land of Canaan, the field that Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite for a burial site. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried, there Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried, and there I buried Leah, the field and the cave in it bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished his instructions to his son, he drew his feet into the bed and, breathing his last, was gathered to his people.
Thank you, Mark. Let me invite David and Susan. Would you like to read beginning at the start of chapter 50?
– Joseph flung himself upon his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph ordered the physicians in his service to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. It required 40 days, for such is the full period of embalming. The Egyptians bewailed him 70 days, and when the wailing period was over, Joseph spoke to Pharaoh's court, saying, do me this favor and lay this appeal before Pharaoh. My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. Be sure to bury me in the grave which I made ready for myself in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, let me go up and bury my father, then I shall return. And Pharaoh said, go up and bury your father as he made your promise on oath.
So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the officials of Pharaoh, the senior members of his court, and all of Egypt's dignitaries, together with all of Joseph's household, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the region of Goshen. Chariots, too, and horsemen went up with him. It was a very large troop. When they came to Goren ha-Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they held there a very great and solemn lamentation, and he observed a mourning period of 7 days for his father. And when the Canaanite inhabitants of the land saw the mourning at Goren ha-Atad, they said, this is a solemn mourning on the part of the Egyptians. That's why it was named Abel Mitzrayim, which is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had instructed him. His sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah, the field near Mamre, which Abraham had bought for a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Susan. Ruth, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 15?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Joseph's brothers, seeing that their father was dead, now said, perhaps Joseph still bears us enmity and intends to repay us for all the harm that we have inflicted upon him. So they brought a charge to Joseph, saying, your father left this charge before his death, saying, thus shall you say to Joseph, please, I beg of you, forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sins, though they inflicted harm upon you. Yet now please forgive the transgression of the servants of your father's God. Joseph wept as they spoke to him. His brothers also prostrated themselves before him and said, here we are, your slaves. Joseph said to them, have no fear, for am I in place of God? Though you intended me harm, God intended it for good, in order to accomplish what is now the case, to keep alive a numerous people. Now, therefore, have no fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he did comfort them and speak straight to their hearts.
If everyone else could please keep muted because we're hearing some feedback. Thank you. Some background noise. Thank you. Why don't you finish up, Ruth?
Do you want me to continue?
Sure.
Okay. Hang on. Let me just turn the page. Oh, I gotta make sure. Hang on. Yeah, everybody mute. Sorry, okay, here we go. Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's grandchildren, the children of Mashir too. Manasseh's son were born on Joseph's knees. Joseph then said to his kin, I am dying, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up out of this land to the land that God promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Joseph adjured Israel's children, saying, God will surely take care of you. Bring my bones up from this place. Joseph died aged 110 years. They embalmed him and he was put in a coffin in Egypt.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, everyone. That's our Torah portion for the week. It concludes the book of Genesis. And so I'd like to just share with you a little bit of a focus study. And then I'll invite everyone to share with me your own unique insights and thoughts about this week's Torah portion. I'd like to begin by looking at the graphic that I've placed on the study sheet for this week. It's a painting by the great impressionist Claude Monet, and it's one of his water lily paintings. This is Water Lily Pond, which he painted it in 1917. And one of the things that's quite striking about it, something that he did in this painting, as he did in all of his water lily series of paintings, that was quite unique for the time and quite contrary to the way paintings have been created on canvases, is that Monet painted all the way to the edges of the canvas. And in that sense, what he did was he didn't frame an image for us. And I think perhaps it's because he didn't want us to view these water lilies with a sense of detachment and framing. I think he wanted us to experience what was before us, wanted us to immerse ourselves in the scene here. And so this is quite extraordinary for the time and defied the notion of where is the end of the canvas. And so this is part of the theme that we're going to be covering during this focus station. Where is an end? What does it mean to have an ending of anything? And Monet was defying the notion of where the canvas ends and consequently where should the image come to a conclusion. And then I also included underneath the graphic a quote from Claude Monet, in which he talks about his works here. He says, "I have come back to things that are impossible to do. Water with weeds waving in the depths. Apart from painting and gardening, I am good for nothing. My greatest masterpiece is my garden." Well, Monet, especially in his later years, did more than paint. He was devoted to his garden, to his beautiful garden. And here, Monet is doing something quite special, quite in the words that he's sharing with us, as he does with his canvas itself, because he's blurring the distinction between how he lives and how he, if I can make up the word, artists, how he creates on canvas. He's saying there is no differentiation between what I am presenting to you and what I do. My gardening is my work of art, and what's on this canvas is of that. And so once again, he's blurring the distinction between how one spends one's time in terms of an avocation, in terms of perhaps a vocation, and how one spends one's time as a creative being. So the title for this week's study session is Confounding Beginnings and Endings. And the Torah portion itself, the very layout in a Torah scroll of this week's Torah portion, provides us with really the impetus, the provocation, if you will, for discussing what's an ending and what's a beginning. Because there is a rule of writing a Torah scroll that there's supposed to be a sufficient number of spaces between the ending of one Torah portion and the beginning of the next Torah portion. There's supposed to be the equivalent, a space that's the equivalent of about 9 letters in between where one Torah portion ends and the next Torah portion begins. With this week's Torah portion, the final one in the book of Genesis, that rule has been violated. And I've shared with you on the study sheet a graphic that shows you that that's the case. So if you'd like to see here, if you have it before you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down from the top, and then reading over from right to left, you have the word Shana, and then you have the word Vayechi. Vayechi is the opening word for this week's Torah portion, but there's no space. There's only a space of a single letter, if you will, between the start of this week's Torah portion and the end of last week's Torah portion, Vayigash. So, of course, that provokes a lot of commentary about why is there no space between last week's Torah portion and this week's Torah portion? Why, the commentators ask, is it closed rather than open? And indeed, that's a little bit of commentary that we have here from Rashi, who says, why is this passage closed? So there's a lot of midrash, and Rashi has his commentary about speculating about what it means that this Torah portion is closed, that there's no space between the end of the last one and the beginning of this one. We're not going to go into all the permutations and all the commentaries and interpretations about what it means that it's closed, but for our purposes, what it does is it allows us to now think about how this whole book of Bereshit, of the book of Genesis, opened, and now how it's closing. And we've discussed before about the nature of the very opening of the book of Genesis, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, and we talked about how the very first word, Bereshit, causes us to pause and think about there's something unfamiliar and ambiguous and certainly unclear about this very first word, Bereshit. It doesn't grammatically make any sense. And so what we've learned is that the opening requires some participation, some creative energy on our part to draw some meaning out of it. The clarity is not presented to us. We have to dig into it and figure out what is happening here. And so usually when we have a beginning to a story, the beginning of a story kind of makes it very clear the setting and where things are going, who the characters are, and gets us grounded, if you will, in some journey that we're going to be going on in this story. And here with Bereshit, it doesn't do that. It ambiguates us rather than clarifies things for us. And so we are confounded by this notion about the beginning is supposed to make things clear. It's supposed to get us oriented, get us located, and instead it kind of pulls the rug out from under us. This week's Torah portion, the concluding one, if you will, in the book of Genesis, does something similar about endings. Just as Bereshit confounded us about the nature of a beginning, Vayechi is confounding us about what is the nature of an ending. And we're going to look a little bit about how one can handle what has been presented to us as an ending. And we're going to look at two different characters and the different ways that they handle what seems to be a concluding episode in a family's life. We're going to look at the way Jacob handles it and the way Joseph handles it. So if you have the study sheet, you can look at number 2. And I have here verses from Jacob. First, noticing Joseph's sons, Israel asked, "Who are these?" And then later, as he's on his deathbed, Jacob called for his sons and said, "Gather yourselves, and I will tell you what will happen to you in the end of days." The first verse, where Jacob says to Joseph about the 2 sons that have been brought to him, "Who are these?" Now, it's clear he knows who they are. And then when the 2 grandchildren are presented to him for a blessing, Jacob crosses his hands, and instead of putting his hands directly on he crosses his hands as to kind of give the younger one over the older and the older underneath the younger to reverse the priority. We'll discuss what all that might mean in just a second. And then in the second verse, Jacob called his sons, "Gather yourselves together, and I will share with you what's going to happen in the end of days." And then the commentaries note, he doesn't really go off and tell them everything that's going to happen in the future. It's almost as if he pauses and then decides against giving a sense of prophecy about what will happen in the end of days. Instead, he talks about each son and their qualities and so forth. So what's happening here in terms of how Jacob is handling this closing, this concluding moment in the family's life, is Jacob is seeking to somehow provoke. He's somehow seeming to stir up further questions. And with the concluding blessing for all the sons, instead of giving them an answer, a prophecy, an explanation about everything that's going to happen, he has kind of second thoughts about that. According to all our midrashim, he has second thoughts about that and thinks to himself, best not to explain everything that's going to happen, best not to give a complete answer and clarification about the future. That might be best left up to them. So he refuses to give an answer that would explain everything and allows some ambiguity, some provocation, some lack of clarity to persist. Joseph, on the other hand, handles this concluding episode in the family's life very differently. When Jacob insists upon crossing his hands over Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph is startled by this. And he says, Joseph said to his father, "No, not so, father, for this is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head." It is as if here Joseph is trying to impose some order, some clarity to this moment. And then at the very end of our portion, after Jacob has died, his brothers seem to be somewhat concerned. Oh my gosh, what if Joseph is still mad at us and angry at us? Maybe now that our father is dead, maybe he'll take revenge upon us. And Joseph speaks to them and says, fear not, I will sustain you and your young ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke to their heart. He is seeking at this moment to reassure the brothers that he's not going to seek revenge on them. He's trying to create a sense of calm. He's trying to, if you will, create that happily ever after ending to the story. So here are two very different approaches to handling this ending point in the story, in the life of this family, this moment. With Jacob is seeking to continue a sense of questioning. He's seeking to continue a sense of irresolution, if you will, perhaps as a way to inspire greater initiative and responsibility from those around him. Joseph ever the supreme administrator, director, perhaps an engineer, if you will. He's trying to provide order and clarity and resolution. So these are two very different approaches to handling this point of conclusion, if you will. We have here number 3, a quote from literary critic D.A. Miller in his book, Narrative and Its Discontents, The Problems of Closure in the Traditional Novel. He writes, the narrative of happiness is inevitably frustrated by the fact that only insufficiencies, defaults, deferrals can be told. Traditional narrative is a quest after that which will end questing. Closure is an act of make-believe, a postulation that closure is possible. I think what D.A. Miller here is trying to get at is that life cannot be so easily resolved as a story in a book can. The story in a book has to come to an end with two covers, one marking the beginning, the other cover marking the end. And literature, he says, is seeking to impose something that life itself does not offer, which is a final end, closure, and resolution to a story. So that's why he calls narrative and its discontent. So if you have this sheet, we'll turn over and we'll explore a little bit more about this notion about endings and beginnings, the possibility for closure and resolution. And this is from Edmond Jabé. Edmond Jabé is a Jew born in Cairo in 1921, I believe. And then he's forced to leave Egypt in 1956 as a result of the Suez crisis, where he can no longer stay in Egypt. He goes to Paris, France. For him, that constitutes exile. And in Paris, rather than finding comfort, resolution, sanctuary, he encounters deep embedded anti-Semitism. And he feels in France that he's ever the outsider. And he writes, because commercially he has to, he writes in French, but for him, he's now forced to write outside of his own native language. So he develops this sense of departure, of fracture from his homeland, separation from his own language, and then the most horrible and impactful fracture of all is the Holocaust. And as a result of all of this, he develops a form of writing which is itself full of fracture. And if you look in his books, you see that it's not laid out typographically. The topography is spread out over the page, and it's not all linear. But here's what he wrote in his book, The Book of Shares. You have opted for security, tranquility, for the answer. I have chosen insecurity and worry, the question. I mark time at the edge of life, whereas you have already reached death's shore to die on the threshold. For Jabé, everything is fracture, and language and the way it's even presented has to reflect that sense of fracture. But for him, perhaps there's something redemptive about that, because as he indicates here, to have an answer that's the end of everything. That's the end of questing. That's the end of search. That's the end of one's purpose. That's death. So for him, there is something about having the sense of being on the edge of everything, of not knowing, of living within the question. That is what the essence of life is actually all about. In number 5, we now step back in time to the Talmud. There are a number of reasons why I share this particular story from the Talmud. So first, it's from that volume of Talmud called Ta'anit, which is about fast. When should one fast? How should one fast? And then this particular episode in the Talmud, the very first question that the Talmud deals with, the Mishnah that the Talmud deals with here, has to do with the prayer for rain. And it asks the question, on what day should we begin to pray for rain? Well, that makes sense that it happens in a volume about fast, because what happens if it doesn't rain when it's supposed to rain? Well, maybe you're supposed to have a fast. Okay? So it makes sense that one of the earliest questions that they've got is about something that's so important, especially in the land of Israel, which is the need for rain. And you need to have rain that begins at a certain time of the season. And if it doesn't happen then you need to take some steps to try and repair whatever relationship with God has been broken to make sure that rain comes again. So that's how this starts off. In the course of this discussion about when should we begin to pray for rain, the rabbis go off on a lot of tangents. And it's actually, we come up with this little story that they tell about it's inappropriate to talk during dinner because you might choke. And so we pick it up at this point. After they had finished dinner, Rabbi Yitzchak said, and this is what Rabbi Yochanan said, our father Jacob did not die. Rabbi Nachman said, what? What? Surely there was eulogizing and embalming, and they buried him. Was it for nothing that they did this? Rabbi Yitzchak says, I'm interpreting a biblical verse. The word for interpreting here, dorish. The reason I have this story is because, of course, it mentions what we just read about, which is the death of Jacob. And Rabbi Yitzchak is saying this outrageous thing, Jacob really didn't die. And there's a textual basis for him to say that, because in what we just read, it doesn't say that Jacob died. It said, let's we look at it right now. It says that he drew his feet into the bed, and breathing, at last he was gathered to his people. And so Rabbi Yitzchak says, well, it doesn't say he died, it just says he drew his feet into his bed and he was gathered to his people. And of course, the more rational person at this dinner party, Rabbi Nachman says, what are you talking about? Afterwards, it says they mourned, they embalmed, and they buried him. And Rabbi Yitzchak responds, hey, I'm just interpreting what the verse says. Now, one of the aspects about Talmud, and one of the reasons why I wanted to introduce this, is that the Talmud is this glorious exercise that combines both free association, which is what we're dealing with here. In just a few pages, we've gone from a very serious and important question. When should we start to pray for rain? And we've ended up in this conversation about whether it's appropriate to have conversations while you're eating dinner, and then this little kind of outrageous interpretation about, hey, by the way, Jacob never really died. So in just a few pages, this free association has taken us in all these directions. On the other hand, the Talmud is also this wonderful exercise in order and law, trying to frame things and analyze things in such a way that we can come to decisions, so we can clarify how we're supposed to act in the world and when we should start saying the prayer for rain. So it is both. It is a volume that contains both free association and an insistence upon order and law. So let's see with number 6, what one of the great Hasidic rabbi, the Sfat Emet, he's going to take this same episode in the Talmud and he's going to take it in a slightly different direction. Number 6. Even though he was in the land of Egypt, he knew that all of Egypt was just a hiding, inside of which there was nothing but that divine life force. In the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan says, Jacob, our father, did not die. When the sages objected, but he was mourned, embalmed, and buried for naught, Rabbi Yochanan answered, hey, I'm just interpreting scripture. Sfat Emet goes on to say, when a person seeks to interpret scripture and struggles at it, oral Torah is created. Such a person can find some of the light that comes from Jacob, our father's living, even within a hiding. As a Hasidic rabbi, what the Sfat Emet is doing is now taking this discussion that's happened in the Talmud, and he's now applying it to the psychological and spiritual dimension. He's now saying, oh, Egypt is not just a geographical place, it's also a state, a certain state of being, of existence. And that Egypt, he describes, Egypt is, in a sense, a hiding. But even within that hiding, there is a light of life, a light of God. And when someone takes the time to struggle to understand what's happening, to lend some creative, interpretive energy to what one sees or reads or hears, then you're letting loose something that's full of the life force, and it can burst through that hiding that he calls Egypt. And that perhaps is what is meant by Jacob never died. There is that essence, that light that is still present within the hiding that he calls Jacob, that once one begins to interpret it, one can bring that life force out to the surface. Our seventh commentary here is from the great theorist Jacques Derrida from his book, Writing and Difference. And he says, and yet did we not know that the closure of the book was not a simple limit among others? That only in the book, coming back to it unceasingly, drawing all our resources from it, could we indefinitely designate the writing beyond the book? Here is Derrida trying to point out to us that to have a book with its covers and its first page and its last page, one should not presume that there's but a single understanding about it all. And that it's only by returning to it and returning to it again and again. And perhaps he's not even referring to this meaning a book, but perhaps we ourselves are books. By constantly returning to this source of text, can we begin to understand how infinite are the possibilities there. And once again, I'm thinking now of what Jabez instructed us just a little bit above. The notion that there is an answer is so limiting and is so full of what one might call the end of everything. It's the death of everything. To think there is a final understanding and a final answer. The need to go back, to go back, to go back, to dig deeper, to dig deeper. That seems to be what Derrida here is saying. Because then when you keep going back and digging deeper, you come up with new writing, the writing beyond the book, beyond that which has been canonized, if you will. And of course, that's what the whole and the rabbinic enterprise has been about, which is the unceasing search for deeper and deeper meaning. So here's how I'd like to conclude. Number 8 is from Prophet Amos. And it's from chapter 5, verse 4. Thus said Adonai to the house of Israel, seek me, and you will live. And the word that's used there for seek me is Yirshuni, which is the same word that was used in our Talmud section, where Rabbi Yitzchak says, I'm interpreting a biblical verse, Doresh, the same verb that's being used here in Amos. The word Doresh, Darash, Midrash, is more than just kind of a literary, analytical interpretation. It is some kind of reactivation of life. It is some kind of digging deep enough into the source of all life, which sometimes gets manifested in the form of words on a page, perhaps a painting, perhaps a song. And the verse from Amos seems to be telling us that as long as we engage in this act of seeking, we live. My hope and prayer for all of us on this, especially on this New Year's Eve, we conclude, if you will, 2020, move into 2021. This evening, when we conclude reading the book of Genesis, that we'll realize that as long as we keep seeking, we will bring new life to this world. We will reanimate ourselves and bring blessings to all those around us. So with that, I would so much love to hear what interested you in this week's Torah portion, what provoked you, what thoughts you have about it, what insights you have. If you'd like to raise your hand, I'd love to call on you. Thank you. Steve, yeah.
I'll say that I've been provoked. I don't know that I follow the point in everything that I may be paying any attention to. So this week's section ends, or when I'm thinking about this, we've been talking about Joseph for a long, long time, or it seems like this, the last several weeks have been all about Joseph. And yeah, it's about Jacob too, but it's about Joseph. And I don't know if I'm missing something. Joseph asks for his bones to be brought up out of Egypt. And the last sentence is, Joseph died, aged 110 years. They embalmed him and put him into a coffin in Egypt. I don't know if I've missed it or if he ever gets brought up out of Egypt. And so to me, that was like an unsettling ending, because I've been looking, while I've been sitting here, I went back to find, I go back to Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, about God talking to Abraham, and know that you and your descendants shall be strangers in a land not theirs. They shall be enslaved and afflicted for 400 years. And so it's like, I don't know that they brought Joseph back up to Israel. And I see a big space of 400 years now, which is long enough for everyone to forget that Joseph lived or had special dispensation for the Israelites in Egypt. And the next thing, we're up to Moses. And then the only other thought I had there, we got to this point after Noah. Noah was in an ark, made a new landing after a flood, start the whole story over again. We're ending this story not knowing, or I'm ending it not knowing what happened. And then all of a sudden, I picture Moses in a basket, and we're like a new ship landing. Well, still in Egypt, but it's like beginning of a whole new story. Anyway, I don't know what any of it means, but that's what intrigued me.
Well, aren't you lucky that you don't think you know what any of it means? Because now you would really want to keep reading more, and you want to try and figure it out. This is so great. Yeah. So part of the aspect about Joseph and his bones, let's read what we'll be reading forward over the next few weeks. We'll see what did happen with Joseph's bones. Did they get brought forward? Were they left behind? And when I read about Moses and being in the basket, I wonder, does it make me think about Noah and the container, not so little, the container that he was in? And if it makes me think about Noah, what does that mean about Noah and Moses? And it'll be so thrilling. Thank you, Steve, for bringing up all those images and all those thoughts. Thank you. Okay. Others about what? David?
Rabbi Yitzhak, quoting Rabbi Yohanan, says he's drashing a biblical verse where it doesn't say that Jacob died. But in our English translation, it says Joseph's died.
Joseph or Jacob?
Again. Yeah. So what that says to me is, what Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Yochanan are talking about is just looking at that one little chunk wherein Joseph doesn't die and try. What?
Yeah.
Okay.
You mean Jacob or Joseph?
Jacob. I don't know what I said.
You said Joseph.
But thank you for knowing what I meant. And then we're in this your item 6 where or actually what is it, the Shepherd Demet, I forget. Anybody says that Jacob was in Mitzrayim, in this narrow confined place, and he knew that the presence of God was there, and that when we wrestle with Torah, maybe just a little tiny piece of it, and comes up with something that opens our eyes, it's the life of Jacob arising up inside of us, sort of. And I just find that to be very metaphorical, but very, very vividly connected to sometimes the experience that I have when I dive into Torah and go, oh, wow, it means this. And then somebody says something that says, no, this other thing contradicts it, or I notice something that contradicts it. But still go back to that first aha based on a tiny little piece. Oh, one other thing. I know a lot of people really disappointed with the ending of the Game of Thrones. And I think that Jacques Derrida is just saying, you just need to go back to the prior seasons over and over and over again and get your own ending out of it.
Thanks, Dave. Let me get Martine and Ruth, and we'll cover some of these. Go ahead, Martine.
There we go. One of the things that has always perplexed me is Jacob switching the blessings for Ephraim and Manasseh. And I've always thought of it in the past as, well, he's kind of justifying what he did with Esau. That and then also Joseph is greater than his older brothers. And now I'm thinking about it in a different way, thanks to the backside of your study sheet. That to me, the second page of your study sheet has said, here's the way that it's so easy to interpret it on the surface. Here's the first kid that comes out and this is the way it is. But, if you go deeper, if you go to, the second kid, that there's a deeper meaning, that there are more meanings, there are more things, more questions to ask than just what appears on the surface. And so that's kind of how I'm feeling about that flip during this view. And I thank you for prompting some different thinking.
Well, here's what you got me to think about, Martine. Let's say we're in a meeting at work or in our community. We're at a meeting. There are some of us who are just so oriented towards sticking to the agenda, making sure that all the tasks get assigned, making sure that everything gets done. And then there's someone in the meeting who disrupts everything by wanting to take us on a tangent, or wants to blow up the agenda, or who says, but wait a minute, have you thought about this way of doing things? And those of us who are oriented towards order and finality and checking off, making sure things are getting done, protocol, can get very uncomfortable with people that want to, in a sense, blow up the meeting with new questions or new ways of doing things. And on the other hand, those of us who are perhaps more vision-oriented or dreamier, we feel so constrained by people that want to just make sure that we adhere to the time frame of the agenda, 6 minutes on this item, 10 minutes on this item, who want to limit the conversation, drives us crazy. So this is now what you're getting me to think about, is how these two different personality types, Jacob, who at the very end, what surfaces is the character that he really is, this trickster, this provocateur, this almost manipulator, if you will. But maybe it's not always for a bad outcome that he does these things. And then there's Joseph, who is this administrator supreme, who knows how to get things done, who can assign tasks, who can delegate, who understands how to get the damn vaccines from Pfizer into people's arms so that we do get 1 million a day done. If Joseph were here, he'd be able to do it. He's that good at logistics. So these are these two different personality types that are dealing with things. And here they're dealing with what seems to be a critical point in a family's life. And how do you deal with this critical point? Jacob wants to kind of keep things in somewhat of disarray. He wants to overthrow, if you will, what is everyone expects to be the outcome of things. And he refuses to provide an answer for everything about what's going to happen, because he believes the only way to move forward is if people remain curious, engaged, feeling that they have to figure something out rather than the answer being given to them. And Joseph is handling this crisis at the end by saying, okay, there's this tension in the family. I need to resolve this tension, because otherwise we're going to kill each other as we on the way back to Canaan to take our dad's body to be buried. So which is right, which is wrong? Some of us carry more one way than the other within us. And hopefully, in certain circumstances, one should prevail over the other. But which should prevail when? That's a bit of artistry, I think. But so thank you, Martin. Ruth, did you have something you wanted to share? Yeah.
Yes, several things. It's great to be here.
Great to have you.
The parashat is interesting, but then I'm struck. The study sheet is really interesting. So, because that's where I really it really provokes my thinking. Excuse me, I have allergies. I'm not enough COVID. I've got allergies. Excuse me. I'm so fascinated by the very idea that you could have an end, like the idea that the ending is even questionable, that you could even have like the idea of closure, because in life it seems very difficult to have closure with anything, or even any idea of resolution. But of course, in the novel is beautiful. You can just make it all happen. It's like a wonderful thing. I was just going, the 6-part Pride and Prejudice, the great A&E version, and it's so resolved. Everybody's happy at the end. And if only it were that way, but of course, it's not. But I was struck by the idea of, even though maybe there is no answer, like there's no answer, like there is no aha, we're still compelled to look. We're still compelled to, I mean, I can't stop trying, even though I know it's futile. You know, it's like I'm determined. So I keep trying. But on some level, there's no answer. But we feel so, I know I feel so compelled to keep trying, even though, you know, it's, there may be no answer. Anyway, that's my philosophical take on the whole thing.
Well, the lesson from Talmud, Ruth, is that there are some things and some times about which we do need to come to a conclusion and an answer about. We do need to know when, as a community, we're supposed to start reciting our prayer for rain.
Okay. So there's certain things, and that's maybe what helps us.
On the other hand, the fact that we have these long discourses about it hints that let's keep talking about it, because even though we've made a decision, maybe we'll come to a better understanding about it, and maybe we'll change the decision at some point if we understand things better. So the Talmud is both this notion about make a decision, come to a conclusion, and keep talking, because maybe there'll be a new decision and a new conclusion.
Okay, so that seems very Jewish to me, because I think I remember growing up and hearing my dad or my mom say something like that, and I couldn't deal with, it seemed like, oy vey, give it a rest. You know, I couldn't handle it when I was a kid. It was like more than my little brain could deal with. But you know, I think maybe that's true though, because sometimes the answer isn't the final answer. You got to keep it, because it changes. It seems like we live in a time where there's no ending. It's like we think maybe there'll be an ending, but we don't know there's an ending. We have to see what happens. It's so distressing. Like we hope there's an ending, but we don't know. Anyway.
Thank you, Ruth. I understand. And Susan, and then Mark.
You're unmuted.
I am? Okay. So the second half of your study sheet reminded me of my granddaughter this morning. For the last many months, she and her brother and her mother have painted friendship rocks, just little rocks, and they painted something on it, and then they'd go on walks around the neighborhood and they'd just leave a rock. And she this morning got dressed in an outfit that she said looked to her like a friendship rock. And so she was now invisible.
I'm invisible. I'm wearing my friendship rock dress.
And so
That's great.
isn't that great? And I just was like
invisible.
struck it.
David, are you saying that you also had a dress like that?
I'm saying I wish I was my granddaughter.
You know, I mean, to see ourselves as something else and to see something else as different than others see it. It's just so helpful and so rare.
That's lovely. That's how fortunate you were to experience that. That's lovely. Thank you, Susan. Mark?
So thank you, Rabbi, and thank you everyone else for all your thoughts. It's very provocative and has me thinking a lot of different things. What struck me about the Parsha this time, and perhaps it's because where I'm at it and what I'm doing in parts of my life, is the question, you know, Jacob had a lot of things to say about each of his sons on his deathbed. They were powerful and perhaps traumatic in some ways. And it could have been helpful for his sons for helping them learn and grow and become better people. Why did he wait till his deathbed?
What do you think?
I don't know. I think sometimes those are hard conversations to have. And you have to be ready to share those things. I think you may be concerned that people aren't ready to hear those things. You don't want to offend them. You don't want to upset the relationship or rock the boat. There are lots of reasons not to. But is there something that I can learn from this that might help me say things that might help other people that I have a relationship with, today, as opposed to putting it off for reasons that may or may not really have validity? And I think that's what this parsha has gotten me thinking about on a personal level.
Mark, thank you so much. Here's what you got me to think about, which is one of the primary lessons that I've been taught by my teachers about teachings and sermons is this. Can this person hear this message from this deliverer at this time? And what you got me to think about is, well, maybe if Jacob had said all these things like 10, 20 years ago, it could have created all this bitter rivalry and dissension and suspicion among the brothers. And maybe at this moment, he's thinking that maybe with my being gone and Joseph being a figure who will assert his new authority to assure that there'll be some kind of control, some kind of cohesion within the family. Maybe that will prevent brothers from being against one another or feeling jealous and so forth. And maybe they will take what I have to say just individually, internally, and think about it themselves, rather than using it as weapons against one another. Because Joseph, I know, will be there to do what he does best, which is to bring order out of chaos. Maybe that was it. Thank you so much for raising that
Thank you.
issue. Richard?
Thank you. Yes, a couple things. One, at the beginning of our last portion, the line was, "And Joseph lives." And the business of picking up his feet, Jacob picking up his feet, that's also used elsewhere in terms of someone who's starting out on a journey. And about Judah, the staff, his scepter will never depart from between his feet. Well, it did. And out of that came Perez, and out of that came David. But that was a breach of some kind, but yet it was his staff. And the thing that intrigued me most about Joseph is that he says, "What am I, a substitute for God?" And everywhere in the story of Joseph, he never claims he's God. He comes close when he says, "God will interpret your dream." So he has a link somehow. And it's Pharaoh and the jailer who really thinks God is inside him. And Joseph has all these cloaks, and we're all cloaked. And what got me on this track today was you talked about the painting. It has no edges. We're just given the experience. Well, if we think not of Joseph as an individual, but as someone who's part of our experience, and he's alive, same way Jacob's alive still, and there's a little light. And that's something that's available to all of us. And when David said that he has a flash when he's studying, sometimes it's there. Well, certainly in many traditions or meditation practices, it is about surrendering their ego and being cloaked in that cloth. And sometimes something will come through you, and you're not out desiring something or forming something. You're just, it's coming through, whatever needs to come through. And I think that the story about Joseph in this chapter tells us that that's available to us all if we behave morally and conscientiously and pay attention to the rules and give the focus, not so much behaving by the ritual, but allowing it to shape our consciousness to see that we're all together in this mess and there's just one thing here, and that's whatever you want to call it. And I think this gives us a clear insight into where the mysticism in Judaism comes to, and why it is that Rabbi can say, Jacob lives.
Very cool.
Nobody dies. There's no endings.
No ending. So here's how I'd like to wrap this up. You've so enriched my study, everyone, of this portion. I'd like to go back to Monet's painting, because with that painting, Monet is trying to help us understand that we're not just looking at an image, we are living an experience. We are inside that experience. And he says that in his words. What I'm presenting on the canvas is what I'm living. I'm living the gardening, and I'm presenting that on the canvas, and it overflows the edges of the canvas because there is no end to it. It just goes on and on and on. And that's the way we are encouraged to deal with this material as well, to realize that it looks like it has finiteness because it has a cover. But really, it is an experience. And rather than framing it and viewing it with detachment, if we place ourselves inside of it, then we are experiencing it. We're living it. We're living Torah. And through living Torah, we begin to engender more Torah. If we are in the painting of the lilies, then we are not merely looking at it with detachment. We are engendering more growth, more lilies. So my hope and prayer for all of us as we leave behind a year, a very difficult year, and enter in to 2021, that we will see how invaluable each one of us is in living this experience we call life. Because to the extent that we don't merely take a step back and view with detachment what's going on, but are engaged and immersed in it, we engender new life, new hope, and new possibility. God bless you all, and Happy New Year. Be well,
New
everyone.
Year.
Cheers.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Be well.
Here.
Great to see everybody. Happy New Year.
Happy New
You
Year.
too.
I'm glad I just landed here by accident, and I'm glad I did. You
No.
never know.
Excellent landing.
Yeah, you never know.